Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you're just starting out building a watercolour palette and you're not completely sure which colours you should be getting, what kind of palette you should be getting, then hopefully this video will help. So there are two main types of palettes that you can get, and that is ones that fill straight into the palette with no pan, and the other kind are like these two, which both have metal grills here that you fill with pans. Pans are these little plastic things that you can fill with liquid watercolour paint, and then you just insert them in here like this. These are all half pans, but you can also get full pans, which are basically just double the size. But I just like to get half pans because I can fit more colours into my palette at once. You'll notice that artists who paint in their studio more than they do outside will generally use something like this, just because they don't really need to worry about transporting it or the paint falling out or anything like that. So I do use this one when I'm painting inside quite a bit, just because it's nice and big and it has a lot of space. This is just one from Jackson's Art, and I'll link everything that I'm talking about in the description below. But what I use more often is these kind of pans, just because they're easy to swap the colours around, and I am very indecisive when it comes to the colours in my palette, so I like that. And also they're just easier to transport. So this one is from Sketchlandia, which I got from a company here in Australia called Larry Post, and this is one I've been using for a long time now, and that's the Medine watercolour palette. So once you've chosen your watercolour palette, the next thing is to decide what colours you want to fill it with. This is quite a big topic and there's a lot that can be said, but I thought I'd just start off by showing you my most used colours and the ones that I think would be the most useful for a beginner starting out. My number one colour that I recommend for starting out is actually a combination of colours. So that is ultramarine blue, and you can use French ultramarine or just normal ultramarine blue, it doesn't really matter, and burnt sienna, which is a brown colour. The reason I recommend this to start out with, these two colours, is because they work really nicely together and they're just pretty easy to use. They're really good for making shadow colours. They mix together to create a really nice grey colour that's actually known as Payne's Grey, and you can actually buy a whole separate colour called Payne's Grey, which is basically just ultramarine blue and burnt sienna mixed together. And I find myself reaching for these two colours the most, probably out of any two colours on my palette. I've had to restock my supply of these two colours way more times than any other colour. So if you're just starting out, I would say get these two. Even if you just have these two, you could still probably create some great paintings. I have actually done some sketches where I've literally just used these two colours, so you really can do a lot with just these. When you're starting out, you'll want to build a palette that has the three primary colours and an earth tone. So the blue, ultramarine blue, could be your first blue, and then you can use the burnt sienna as your first earth tone, and then you'll need a yellow and a red. So for the yellow, I would recommend the Hansa Yellow Medium. It's quite a medium toned yellow, probably slightly edging towards cool, but it mixes really well with most colours. When you mix it with ultramarine blue, it creates a really nice green that I use all the time for trees and basically anything green. And then that brings me on to the final primary colour I'd recommend, which is Pyrrole Scarlet. There's lots of reds that you could choose as your primary red, but I just like this one because it is really nice on its own. It's very bright. When you mix it with the Hansa Yellow Medium, it creates a really nice orange, which is really nice and bright, which is great for sunsets and things like that. If you can sort of gradiate that, it looks really nice. Another red that you might want to pick up as well as the Pyrrole Scarlet is Quinacridone Rose, and this is actually creates some better purples than the Pyrrole Scarlet does, just because it is a bit cooler, and so it creates some better purples when you mix it with the ultramarine blue. As you can see, it creates some really, really deep purples, which is quite a lot nicer than this purple here. So I would recommend that if you know that you're going to be doing a lot of purples. And purples are just very handy for a lot of things, especially in landscapes. A lot of mountains, as they're going into the distance, you'll want a purple. And also if you want to create some shadow colours on a yellow building, purple is very helpful for that. So I would definitely recommend also getting some Quinacridone Rose. After those basic colours, so that's 5 that I would recommend that you get straight away. After those 5, there are quite a lot of others that I use a lot. So another earth tone, which is more of a yellow earth tone, is yellow ochre. And I use that a lot for beaches and stones and things like that. It's not as strong as burnt sienna, but you can also mix this one with ultramarine blue to create a grey. It's more of a greeny grey because there's more yellow in the yellow ochre, but that is quite handy for doing rocks and sometimes the sides of buildings and things like that. Another colour I've been using a lot for my Earth Sketch challenge is this Cobalt Turquoise Light by Winsor & Newton. And this is just great for doing any tropical scenes, tropical water, and that's just really fun. I wouldn't necessarily say you need to get this one, but if you just want a really fun colour, then I would definitely recommend giving this one a try. And again, on the blues, a blue that I use with almost every painting if I'm doing a landscape is cerulean blue. I use cerulean blue chromium just because it's a bit cheaper. I don't really know the difference, to be honest, but this one seems pretty good to me. And I use this one for doing skies, especially here in Australia, there's a lot of blue skies, so I always use this one for doing skies on a sunny day. If you want a really, really dark earth tone or create a really, really dark grey, I would definitely recommend Burnt Umber. And that is just a deeper, darker version of burnt sienna. And when you mix it with ultramarine blue, I think you're starting to see why I use so much ultramarine blue now, because I mix it with everything. When you mix burnt umber with ultramarine blue, it creates a really, really dark grey, which is just handy when you need to have that pop of dark value, and it just creates a really nice dark grey. And if you need things to be really, really dark in your paintings, a colour I would also recommend is Neutral Tint, and that is basically a grey. It's probably the closest thing to black that you'll have in your palette, but I sometimes just add that on top of this mix of burnt umber and ultramarine blue if I need basically a black, because it is quite hard with watercolour to get very, very dark values, and sometimes, well, almost always you will need some really, really dark value in your painting. So that is something I would suggest if you need some really, really dark values. And then just mixing it with the burnt umber and the ultramarine blue just makes it a bit more interesting instead of just being completely grey, because if you just use it on its own, it is nice, but it's just a bit boring, so I prefer to mix it with some other colours just to make it a bit more interesting. So they are probably the colours that I use the most when I'm painting. There are a few others that I've been using a bit more recently that I really like. One of them is Carbazole Violet, which is just a very, very deep purple. If you compare this purple to this purple, it's just a lot deeper. So it's really, really good if you want a darker violet, and it looks really nice for mountains especially. I really like using it for landscapes and things like that. Another interesting set of colours are the phthalo blues and phthalo greens. I don't use them as much as some of the other colours that I have in my palette, but they are quite useful. So this phthalo green, this is why I don't use them as much, because they don't look as nice on their own. They're quite unnatural looking. They're a bit acidic looking, I think. But when you mix it with Pyrrole Scarlet, which is its complementary, it creates some really, really dark values that look really interesting. And I always think that these colours look a bit creepy, and I think they would be really good for a bit of an ominous painting. I personally don't do many ominous paintings, so I wouldn't use them that often, but they are really nice. Once they're mixed together, they are just really nice. I just wouldn't use the phthalo green on its own. I personally have too many yellows in my palette, and sometimes I get a bit confused about which one's which, but I'm trying to get a bit better of remembering which ones I have, and you can see from which ones have been the most used out of all of these, and that is this one here, which is quinacridone burnt orange. And this one, well, you can just tell it's just really, really nice. It's great for sunsets and just for anything really where you just want a pop of orange, and it is quite a natural orange, so it's really nice in scenery, especially with sunsets. And another one that is good for some kind of sunsets is New Gamboge, which is a slightly yellower version. I feel like these two are quite similar in a way, or give you a similar feeling, but this one is just a bit more yellow rather than orange. One yellow I have in my palette, which I'm probably going to take out, is this Nico Azo yellow. I know that it is good for some things, but I just don't really like it. It just doesn't look nice to me. It looks quite sickly, and I'm probably just going to take it out of my palette soon. So you definitely don't need as many yellows as I have. In fact, it's better to have less of each colour and just know that you really like each of them and get to know them really well, rather than just buying too many colours for the sake of it. One more yellow that I have in my palette, I definitely have too many, is quinacridone gold. There's a whole story to the history of quinacridone gold that I won't go into now, but this is the fake version of quinacridone gold, but it's still very nice. But as you can see, it's quite similar to New Gamboge, so I probably don't need all of these yellows in my palette because they are very similar. And that's one thing I would suggest, is when you're starting out, you probably just need one type of each colour and just stick to that and get to know and understand each colour, rather than buying too many, which is what I've done. And then finally, you'll probably have noticed this one just because it looks so nice. I bought this recently, but I haven't had a chance to use it too much, and it's Lavender by Daniel Smith. It's quite pale, but I think it was going to be really good in the sky, and it might be really good for shadow colours on white buildings, especially on a sunny day. So I think that's probably enough paints for now. This might be slight overkill for a beginner's palette, so if you're a bit confused, then I would say the main recommendations I would give you are Burnt Sienna, Ultramarine Blue, Hansa Yellow Medium, Pyrrole Scarlet, and Quinacridone Rose. With all of those colours, you'll be able to get the massive range of things that you can see here, which is pretty much all you really need when you're just starting out. And then slowly over time you can build it up. And then just one last tip on filling your watercolour pans. I would definitely recommend, once you've filled them up, get a safety pin or the back of an earring or just something, and just mix it to get all of the air bubbles out of the pan. That way it won't go like this one has, where it goes all cracked and weird around the edge and then it can actually fall out really easily. Whereas you can see here with this one, I did it properly and the paint has just sort of stuck really nicely into the pan, and that is quite helpful if you are going out and about and taking your palette with you, going outside, going like this a lot. So that is just one tip. And once I've filled the pans with the liquid paint, I usually wait between 1 to 2 days depending on how hot it is outside, usually closer to 2 days, and then they're ready to go. I do sometimes cheat because I get impatient and just start using it when it's not properly dry, but if you can, wait for it to dry before you start using it. That is pretty much everything I know about building a watercolour palette. Let me know if you have any questions or anything else in the comments and I'll definitely get back to you. But for now, thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one.